Good morning and welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We of course welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. I would ask everyone in-house if you will double check that cell phones have been turned off, especially with the rain in the area and all of the magical warnings about flash floods going off. It might be a little more distracting than usual. We will, of course, post this program on the Heritage homepage following the presentation for everyone's future reference, and our internet viewers are always welcome to send comments or questions simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. Hosting our program today is Rob Gordon, who serves as Senior Advisor for Strategic Outreach in our External Relations Department. He establishes and builds working relationships with new audiences and potential allies, championing ideas and policy solutions. Before joining us here in 2008, he directed several conservation organizations. From 2003 to 2006, he served on committee staff for the House Committee on Resources. In 1989, he founded the National Wilderness Institute, a nonprofit conservation organization. And from 1997 to 2002, he served 2 terms as a member of the Commonwealth of Virginia's Board of Conservation and Recreation. Please join me in welcoming Rob Gordon. Rob?
Thank you, John. And welcome again to the Heritage Foundation. We have a great panel today. And judging from many of the faces I see in the audience, we have a great audience too. So I think we'll get some excellent questions. Let me start by acknowledging Rachel Kopek, the Coalitions Coordinator at the State Policy Network, who's worked with us to promote this event and is working with one of the speakers who's engaged with educating state officials on aspects of federal land ownership. In a few minutes, I will introduce our speakers, and after they've made remarks, we'll take questions. But first, I'd like to offer a little bit of context for our panel, States of Dependence, Reducing Washington's Control of the Western U.S. I think some comparisons regarding land areas are needed because the areas we're discussing are so vast that they're difficult to comprehend. When rural lands not under federal control and the lands under federal control that are rural, BLM, Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, Park Service, are considered together, they are greater than the nation of India. That shouldn't be really too surprising as based on ranking the U.S., we're the third after Russia and Canada. And according to the Natural Resources Conservation Service, as of 2003, only 5.6% of the United States was urban. So we have a huge area that is rural. Now I raise this because most Americans live in urban and suburban areas. Partially or predominantly developed areas are the rule, not the exception, as to what most of us see on a day-to-day basis. And this certainly affects your outlook. And further development close to or within one's already developed little day-to-day world can make it seem as if everything's disappearing. Well, I think this is a very inaccurate perception, and it is something that advocates of expanding government land holdings and imposing barriers and regulations to inhibit productive private land use seize upon. So let me offer a little bit more perspective. Non-federal rural lands total more than 1.3 billion acres, with more than half of that being range or pasture. Now, while these lands aren't owned by the federal government, they are subject to federal laws and regulations that have the effect of land use control in many instances, most commonly carried out through the Endangered Species Act or the wetlands provision of the Clean Water Act. In addition to seeking more stringent controls on private land, the environmental establishment has historically sought to expand the federal estate, often arguing that doing so is the only means of preventing land from being somehow wrecked. But consider this. While Alabama, Connecticut, Georgia, Maine, Mississippi, New Hampshire, New York, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, and West Virginia are not among the states with the largest percentage of federal land ownership, in all of them, significantly more than 50% of the land is forested. Suffice it to say, there's a vast amount of land, range and forest, not under federal control that has not disappeared. as some in the environmental community would like you to believe. Further, I would argue that providing food, fiber, minerals, and energy, improving the well-being of real people, is hardly something that should be calculated as a loss. But on to the federal estate, which is vast. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, for example, manages 12 million acres of public lands and waters nationwide. This would be equivalent to an area bigger than Taiwan or Israel. Now, while that may seem large to some of you, for those who understand a bit more about the federal estate, the Corps of Engineers is a relatively small player. There are 4 large landholding agencies. The National Park Service controls 84 million acres of land, and that's roughly equivalent to the nation of Finland, and requires some 28,000 employees. Now, that sounds pretty big. But what may surprise you is the National Park Service is actually the smallest of the 4 major landholding federal agencies. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is substantially larger, with 551 national wildlife refuges and additional other units, constituting an area of 150 million acres, which is larger than the nation of the Ukraine. And U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service employs some 9,000 people at facilities across the U.S. The Forest Service, again, is larger. It has 155 national forests, 20 national grasslands, and 7 national monuments, totaling 193 million acres. That's larger than the area of Chile. And the United States Forest Service employs some 35,000 people. And then finally comes the Bureau of Land Management. The Bureau of Land Management has 254 million acres, and according to the CIA's World Factbook, that puts it in position 31 compared to the 252 other nations on Earth. It would come in just after Egypt, and it has some 10,000 employees to administer this land. Altogether, we're talking over 260 million acres, which, one last comparison, is larger than France, Spain, Germany, Poland, Italy, England, Austria, Switzerland, Netherlands, and the Belgium combined. And to do so, if Wikipedia is correct, the 4 major landholding agencies have employees that are greater than the military forces of Australia. The federal estate is too large, and it's time we began exploring how at least a substantial portion of these lands can be returned to the states. Our first speaker today chairs the subcommittee charged with overseeing all those lands and federal employees, which, based on the numbers, would seem a formidable task. Rob Bishop is currently serving his 6th term as a member of the United States House of Representatives, representing Utah's 1st Congressional District. He serves on the House Rules Committee, Armed Services Committee, Natural Resources Committee, and is chairman of the House Natural Resources, Public Lands, and Environmental Regulation Subcommittee. Representative Bishop served 16 years in the Utah State Legislature, including as Majority Leader and the unanimously elected Speaker of the House. He served 2 terms as State Chairman of the Republican Party. Representative Bishop was co-founder of the Western States Coalition and past chair of the Congressional Western Caucus. He was also co-founder of the 10th Amendment Task Force in the United States House of Representatives. Prior to engaging in politics, Representative Bishop spent 28 years as a high school teacher in Utah, focusing on American history and government. He's married to Geraldine Hanson Bishop, and they have 5 children and 6 grandchildren, and reside in Brigham City. Following Rob will be Carl Graham. Carl is director of the Sutherland Institute's Center for Self-Government in the West. He came to Sutherland following nearly 6 years as CEO of the Montana Policy Institute, Montana's premier free market think tank and policy research center. Carl completed aviation officer candidate school in Pensacola, Florida, and flew the A-6E Intruder. Following a tour in Japan as strike operations officer for the commander, Carrier Group 5, Carl transitioned to the F-14 Tomcat. He served as squadron operations officer, flying and directing missions over Bosnia and the Persian Gulf, and acting as the carrier air wing liaison officer to the Joint Task Force Southwest Asia. Carl then served as Special Assistant and Legislative Liaison for the Commander of the U.S. Strategic Command in Omaha, Nebraska, advancing his interest in public policy. His final naval tour was with Commander Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. Carl graduated from Montana State University in 1984, earning his master's in National Security Affairs from the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California, and is a Naval War College graduate. Carl was born and raised in Glasgow in the northeast corner of Montana. After a 20-year naval career, he and his wife Cindy decided to settle near Bozeman, Montana, where he was an adjunct professor of aviation science and a flight instructor, and served on the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights Montana State Advisory Committee. He currently resides in Salt Lake City. Please welcome Congressman Bishop.
Thank you. I appreciate that introduction. It's always good to be here. If the fish and wildlife is the size of the Ukraine, is that with or without Crimea? Yeah. Look, I want to tell you, words have meanings, and those meanings become significant. I was walking into work one day wearing a tan three-piece suit, and out of one of the apartments came a teenager. I know he's a teenager because he wasn't wearing shoes, and he had a cell phone in his ear, and he was walking to the car, and as I passed him, he looked up and he said, "That suit is so fly." And as I walked back past him, I was not sure whether I had been complimented or insulted. First, I checked my zipper. That was not an issue. And it was not until I got to the office and talked to my 20-year-old staffers, they said, in modern slang, I had indeed been complimented on that particular suit. We have the words, but unless we have a common understanding of the meaning of those, that is, we're not really communicating. And that's the problem we have with public lands in the United States today, and I think there are two factors that go along with it. The first one is simply the size. I've got medium-sized posters and small ones, so enjoy. Everything that's red is owned by the federal government. And it is true, the federal government owns 1 out of every 3 acres in the United States, but it is concentrated with us in the West. We get the joy of having over half of the West being controlled by the federal government. That means that those of our friends who live in the East have some federal land, but they don't necessarily have that same kind of contact. Let me get the small one, for example. I picked 3 states at random. This is obviously the state of my speaker, my majority leader, and me. In Ohio and Virginia and Utah, everything that is blue is private property. So our good friends in the East, really, they have some public lands in there. They have very little access, very little interaction. The idea of actually working with the Department of Interior is not really coming in concept. Now, in the 1960s, the head of the Park Service at that time came up with this plan that if I can get more parks in more congressional districts, I can get more money. And ironically, Congress was dumb enough to fall for it. So years later, we find there are national parks in 49 out of the 50 states, and Delaware is still frantically trying to find something worthy of a park. They got a monument now, but they sold out cheap. But it's only 13% of the land. The bulk of the land, 44%, is BLM, but unfortunately BLM is only found here in the West. A few bases that have been bracked are now BLM property in the East, but there is no concept of what the BLM does back there. Consequently, when you talk about public lands, my good friends in the East, the only contact they have is a national park nearby. You say public lands to them and they think of a pretty tree by a pretty lake. Those of us who live in the West, we deal with the BLM. When we say public lands, we think of sagebrush. We're talking the same language, we don't mean the same thing, which unfortunately means most people in Pennsylvania and New Jersey and New England, when they say public lands, they think all public lands are Yellowstone. They are not. In fact, sometimes I want to remind them that Yellowstone was established, I think, in 1872 in the territory of Wyoming, and it took us 6 years to actually give them any money. The second national park was only 3 years later, and it was in Michigan, and we gave it back to Michigan because they could better manage the land. They are still managing Mackinac Island and still doing a far better job than we are. It was 18 years before the federal government actually came up with the idea of another national park. So we have those concepts that simply are different. So what it shows us, though, is that, first of all, states can manage land just as well, if not better, than the federal government. In testimony we've had in our committee dealing with the forest lands in Idaho and Washington, we simply found even though Idaho and Washington and the tribes in those two states have fewer forest lands, they get much more production than the federal government over a bigger quality of land, and they have healthier forests, fewer fires, better managed land, less beetle infestation than the federal government has, which simply means you don't have to have everything managed by Washington in order to have it done well. States and tribes are showing that they can do just as good a job, if not a better job. And I also want to point out that in all due respect, sometimes the federal government just hurts people because they have the ability of having decisions made by local officials who sometimes are good and sometimes aren't. I'll give you a couple examples. In Fort Vancouver in Washington, there is a National Historic Site, which was established in '48. Then they had a BRAC and they added more property to this park. So it's basically a community park. They have a pavilion. There are areas that people can go and recreate. The land manager at the site thought the noise that came from the public access area was too loud for the artifacts in her site. So she canceled such things as a church picnic, a youth soccer fair, a concert that was there for the benefit of veterans because the noise that the church picnic would generate would disturb her artifacts in the site. And there was nothing you can do about it except come to Congress and try to put pressure on them in some kind of a bill. Lake Mead in Las Vegas. A taxi driver in Las Vegas was murdered. His body was dumped somewhere out there. They did a search for it, called off the search. The family wanted to hire a company to go in and find the body. It took them 15 months to raise the money so that they could buy the liability insurance to get the special use permit that the federal government insisted the family did. And once they actually raised the money, a year after the death, they found the guy's body in 2 hours. We had an Air Force staff sergeant also drowned in that area. They called off the search. It took the family another 10 months getting an attorney, going to court to have the right to have a search and rescue company who volunteered to help find the body, to allow them to come in on federal land, and actually once they were allowed to come in, they quickly found the body. I mean, we have examples all over this country of federal land managers who actually end up hurting people. In the Tetons, they established in the 1950s that paddling, canoeing, would bother the fish habitats up in that area. They found out later it doesn't have anything to do with it, doesn't bother them at all, but it took too much time and effort to change the rule. So they still banned all sorts of paddling activity on an area that was designed for river recreation. I don't know what you do if you're not in a boat. I mean, fish looking, whatever it is. They banned everything because simply it took them too much time to try and do that. We also have the simple example of federal government in this land process harms kids in the West. Look, up in the first picture, everything that's in red are the states that have the hardest time funding their education system. They raise the least amount of increase in their funds for public education. The bottom is obviously the area that you have public lands. And I hate to say this, but there is a one-to-one relationship between those who have a problem in raising funds for education and those that have public lands, simply because we have less ability to raise taxes. We also have less access to the resources that are there. The West gets screwed over in our education funding compared to what happens in the East. And over a 20-year period of time, it is simply a matter that the East can raise twice the amount of money as the West can for its own public education. We in the West are taxed at a higher rate than those in the East. We put a higher percentage of our local effort and local budgets into education. I'm an old teacher. My kids are harmed by it. My salary was depressed by it. My retirement is still coming through the state education system. You're putting my retirement in jeopardy. That ticks me off. But it's only because we have a different way of looking at the land. And as I said at the very earlier statement of that, one of the problems we have is that people just don't understand what we're talking about when we deal with public lands. That all of the West and public lands are not Yellowstone. One last statistic we found out, and this hits people who actually live in the East. You add up all the revenue that comes from these lands and all the expenses we have from the lands, they're putting up $8 to $9 billion a year out of the pockets of those in the East for the wonderful opportunity of controlling the West. So one of the things we'd like to say, there are three false narratives that I'd like to dispel, and that's my effort here in Congress. Number one is that only somebody in Washington has the view of what is good for the entire country. False narrative number one. False narrative number two, if there's ever a difference of opinion on what should be done on public lands between someone locally and someone in Washington, obviously Washington has to win. False narrative. And narrative number three is the West has to be protected from itself. I am tired of that. My education funding is tired of that. It's time to look at things in a new way of doing it, and that's what we're trying to do in Congress today. I thank you. Thank you for the time, and I'm sorry to have spent so much time boring you with all that.
I'm not sure why I'm here anymore. You guys pretty much got it, I think. Rob, by the way, I have a much shorter bio if you're interested for the next time we do something like that.
You don't often get to introduce an F-14 pilot.
All right. So I'm gonna try to put this into a context maybe of why you folks should care. Representative Bishop did a great job of laying out some of the false premises that are out there, the misunderstandings and the language that we use. But in the West, we're looking at trying to restore a balance, really, a balance between individual and states' rights and responsibilities versus the federal estate and the federal government. And I think that's one of the reasons that you should care about this, because it has a broader context. We're seeing an unprecedented growth, obviously, in federal power right now. The growth of the regulatory state, Obamacare, Dodd-Frank, the Endangered Species Act with sage grouse and prairie chickens, oh my, and everything else. And most of this is being done under an umbrella of cooperative federalism. Where war on coal is a perfect example with new EPA regulations, where the federal government basically buys the rope and then the states use it to hang themselves. And that's one of the things that comes back to federal lands and federal funding that I'm going to touch on both of those. And Western states are particularly vulnerable to this because of a lot of the reasons that Representative Bishop talked about. And so we have both the opportunity and really a responsibility to ask a very simple question. Why not govern ourselves? Why be states of dependence, and why not be able to govern ourselves? Just imagine if we could restore that balance to make government more accountable by bringing it closer to home. To have a servant instead of a master, a government that works for us instead of against us, and really to be able to decide our futures. This is what this is about, is being able to figure out the best way to educate our kids, to steward our lands, to provide for public safety and services using local solutions, local resources, local needs, the solutions reflective of those things, and not imposed on higher one-size-fits-all solutions from experts who really maybe aren't experts at the local level. We can see who's most at risk at this, and you've already had some stuff laid out. By the way, if you missed any of those numbers or comparisons, I got more, so don't worry. You'll have another shot at that. But you can see who's mostly hurt at this by looking at who's manning the barricades out there for the often overreaching and often counterproductive federal policies that we're seeing. The West is kind of the canary in the coal mine because we're the most impacted right away because, again, of the lands issue and the funding dependence issue. So you see ranchers in Nevada getting on their horses and riding to the district BLM offices to protest loss of access or new grazing restrictions on lands they've been on for generations. ATV riders in Utah are risking arrest protesting trail closures on trails, again, that they've been on with their families for generations and responsibly used. County commissioners in New Mexico are threatening to break the locks, tear down barricades put up by federal officials to stop access to water that their ranchers, again, have used responsibly for generations. Accountants, CPAs for crying out loud, calling on the Utah legislature to be more responsible, get a better handle on federal funds and the dependence on federal funds and the costs and risks that come with those funds, and re-looking at the level of dependence that we have there on federal money to perform basic state functions. So the primary vulnerability we have in the West is that we don't control our own resources, and the biggest reason, and here's yet another map to show you the same thing, is that we don't own those lands, 50% of all those lands. 600 million acres of land in the west of the Colorado-Nebraska line is owned by the federal government. That's enough land to cover the entire eastern seaboard, plus Kansas, plus Texas, plus France. That's a lot of land. 91% of all federal lands are in the West, and federal lands make up, on average, about 50% of western states. That's just unfair. That's 50% of land that we're locked out of, 50% of our tax base, 50% of our productive economy, 50% of our economic potential. If the federal government owned half the casinos in Las Vegas and started closing doors or shutting down blackjack tables, God forbid, can you imagine the impact that would have on the Las Vegas economy? If they owned half the Florida beaches and started cutting off access to half of those beaches, can you imagine the impact that would have? Florida has beaches. You could take the list on and on. If they shut down 50% of the trading houses on Wall Street, what impact would that, well, that might not be so bad. But we have in the West the same rights as everybody else, but we're not allowed to exercise those rights because frankly, we came later. We settled those lands later after somebody or a group of people or a system decided to shut those things off from other uses, from productive uses. Some say that they're national treasures and they belong to all of us. Well, yeah, some of them are, but not a lot of them. If you look at the national parks and the wilderness areas, and nobody that I know of is talking about taking over or closing down national parks, wilderness areas, national monuments for the most part, and things like that. These are special lands. They're the exception. They would remain the exception, but they make up a small fraction of the federal estate out in the West. Generally, less than 15% of the federal lands in any given western state are those types of special lands. Most of them are multiple use, designated multiple use lands, as was said before, Forest Service, BLM, some Fish and Wildlife Service, things like that. And it's about 20 to 30 million acres per state out in the West that falls under that multiple use designation, the sagebrush in many cases that you saw the picture of. That's 20 to 30 million acres. That's an area the size of Virginia within each western state, plus or minus a New Jersey or two, depending on the state, that is basically, that we're increasingly losing access to. If we're going to govern ourselves, we need more control over those multiple use lands. And again, we're talking mostly BLM and Forest Service lands that were designated for multiple use, for both recreation and economic uses. 5 states are somewhere in the process. Utah has passed a law, Transfer of Public Lands Act, where they're demanding return of most of the, again, not national parks, not wilderness areas, but those multiple use lands to state control. 4 other states, Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, and Nevada, are studying it, and I expect in 2015, especially if I have anything to do with it and I can help with it, we're going to see legislation similar to Utah's in those states. We're also working in New Mexico to try to get a study bill done there as a first step. At the congressional level, Representative Bishop and others are doing some great work, and I'm not here to critique the various approaches. Each state is probably going to have its unique road in some ways. Each parcel of land is going to have its own unique road in some ways. I'm welcoming all comers to this fight, and we want to lay the groundwork for trying to establish the information for folks like you to understand this issue better and to get each state with its own approach, because these are lands with trillions of dollars in resources, billions of dollars in tax revenues, hundreds of thousands of jobs that are increasingly being locked up by people who really don't understand what's at stake here. And one of the things that's really ironic is that people who claim to worry so much about diversity and care so much about diversity are choking off an entire way of life. They're imposing their values on the rural production economy in ways that they don't understand. So our goal is to stop that, to protect the lands, balance conservation and the betterment of the human condition, to manage those lands for enjoyment and productivity now and long into the future. In short, just be proper stewards of those lands. Another means of Washington's imposition of control is funding. As the representative showed with that great slide, the federal government is taking up an increasing portion of the budgets of states. On average around the country right now, it's about a third of state budgets are provided by federal funds, and this is dangerous. It's also one reason that western states become more dependent on those federal funds is, again, we don't have access to our revenue base in many cases. But these are funds, federal funds, that are being used to tell us how to educate our kids, how to provide for public safety, how to run our businesses, our charities, our government, how to take care of our environment and resources. Those funds come with strings that tell us how to do all those things, and we really have little control over those funds, over what we do with those funds. And that's not just a Western problem, that's across the nation. And those are discretionary funds for the most part. So they're under increasing stress. They're getting squeezed between entitlement spending, and as interest rates return to historical norms, we're going to see them further squeezed between entitlement spending and service of the national debt. So we need to work to create a plan for when those funds come under, when the next federal funding crisis occurs or when those funds come under more pressure. We want to see those funds, and we're helping states develop legislation and policies that see those funds and the strings that are attached to them to measure the risks of accepting them, not just the rewards and the benefits, and the risks of potentially losing them, and creating plans to be responsible, to do what we do in our everyday lives, to budget or to plan for that day when those funds start to disappear or when they're cut in different ways, so that we cut the right programs, we maintain the right programs. And I'll give you a couple examples in a minute, but before I do, there's another thing that I want to quickly point out too, that we're trying to create a movement in the West, and we're trying to publicize and get support for that movement across the country. One state, right now Utah is leading the way on most of these things. That's an anomaly. 2 states, well, that's kind of interesting. 3, 4, 5 states, now you have a movement. That's what we're trying to do by creating coalitions of leaders, political leaders, activist leaders, industry leaders, to get the right things done out there again so that we can govern ourselves, so we can have more control over our destiny. And we provide the tools. Some of them, you saw some of the handouts we have, FAQs and toolkits. We put together these toolkits for each state to try to reclaim our state's rights and restore that proper balance again, and to plan for the future. This goes beyond just wanting to do the right things. This also advances conservatism, which I think is near and dear to a lot of people in this room and in this great place we're here at Heritage. Conservatism and conservative principles are at stake here, and this is something that is a winning issue. These are winning issues for a center-right country, to show the costs of going down the wrong path and to provide an alternative as well, not just show the costs, but also provide a way forward. The left is trying to change the electoral map. They're trying to create a permanent majority by making more people more dependent on, more beholden to, and just flat out scared of criticizing a stronger DC bureaucracy or federal government. They increase dependence by increasing benefits. We're at record food stamp recipient levels. Obamacare creates more dependence, raises the cost of health care, and then subsidizes the increase. What a deal you get there. You take a basic need and you turn it into a government-issued privilege. They're also increasing more people and more companies and businesses beholden, the crony corporatists and special interests out there. I don't believe in crony capitalists. I think it's an oxymoron. If you're a capitalist, you want to have your goods and services out there in the marketplace. You want to compete, so you can't be a crony. If you are a crony, you may be a corporatist who wants targeted subsidies, who wants special tax treatment, who wants regulations that impede others' competition with you. You want a government, and you want to influence a government that's big enough and powerful enough to pick winners and losers and decide who gets to stay in business and who doesn't based on either connections or just having a correct agenda or correct policies. And that's not the American way. It's not what made us great. It's not the direction we can go for very much longer, I think. So they're also trying to create this permanent majority by just creating fear, browbeating, threatening, and silencing opponents. You have political leaders publicly berating individuals, private citizens, calling on agencies to audit or to target private citizens who are engaging in legal speech. You have people threatening their opponents for their political and religious beliefs, calling for the loss of their jobs. They're able to do this because, again, the dependence that we've tacitly agreed to, we've got to cut those apron strings and restore our independence, our ability to self-govern. So we need to find ideas that we can unite behind as a center-right country, and I think these are great ideas, because frankly, I've been right for a very long time. I'm tired of being right. I want to win. And so we've got to have these ideas that we can win, that we can bring people behind by pushing back against federal control and dependence. These are winning issues in the West, and I think they're winning issues across the country. My friend Tom in Malta, Montana, which you've never heard of, but a small town in northeast Montana, he shouldn't be forced off land that his grandfather homesteaded because George Soros saw Dancing with Wolves and wants to put bison out there, wild bison. Jose, a rancher I met at the Heritage Resource Bank, in fact, a few months ago, he shouldn't lose access to land in New Mexico that his family has responsibly grazed and improved since the 1600s because a San Francisco billionaire held a fundraiser for the prairie chicken and has more money than him to get him off of it. A caregiver in Boise shouldn't lose her job over a 10% across-the-board federal budget cut or a sequester or a shutdown or whatever, while we're continuing to run eat your vegetable PSAs because it comes from a different pot of money. States should be able to prioritize those things. This is a philosophical war for the West and the freedoms we cherish and the proper balance between individual fulfillment, the betterment of the human condition, and government power. And these Western issues provide an opportunity for all of us to move forward on those, I think, if we can do it together. And we can show working class families, the old Reagan Democrats, we can show them that there's somebody out there fighting for them and that there's alternatives out there and there's a path forward to them that enhances their traditional values of hard work, of family, of community, They have champions. We can be their champions, and we can move these issues forward. We need the resources under those lands. That's an easy argument to make. But a lot of those folks who want to make those resources available in the rural production economy having a very difficult time because they're effectively being disenfranchised. Their voice is smaller than the urban voice right now. There are more urban voters than there are rural voters, and so they're effectively being disenfranchised. Now, what do I mean by urban voters? It's not a code word or anything. It's a demographic term. It's population density. That's part of it. But it's also a connectedness or a disconnectedness with that rural production economy. There are values and there are ways of working that economy. There are things that are important in that economy that make it work, that the further you get from the land, the less understanding you have of those, and the more likely you are to shunt those aside or not even recognize that you're harming them. And so when you have if you go out west, if you go to Billings, Montana, if you go to Albuquerque, New Mexico, Boise, Idaho, most of the people there will be at most 1 or 2 generations removed from somebody who actually worked the land or logged the land or developed resources from the land. They understand those values. They understand what's needed for that rural production economy. You get into the larger cities, you get to Washington, D.C., as Representative Bishop alluded to, people don't understand that, and so they will unintentionally many times harm the people and the values and the economy that we all need to put electricity in our walls and gas in our cars and everything else. So when rural America goes to work in the morning, they put on their boots, they're not just going to work, they're preserving traditional values and ideals that made this country great. There are people who want to prevent them from doing that. They're powering the greatest economy in the world, thumbing their nose at tin pot dictators everywhere. Again, there are people who want to prevent them from doing that, and some people who don't even want to but are. They're building a stronger, more environmentally responsible and sustainable future through this rural production economy that values hard work, that values family, that values community. And in the meantime, or by doing that, they're feeding and powering the world. There's people who don't understand the value of that, and they're trying to stop them. Self-determination, self-government, that's what really is at stake in this war for the West that we're seeing picking up steam right now. It's not about dollars and cents. It is for some people. But where it really matters, this isn't a dollar and cents issue, at least not for those who have the most to lose. It's about basic fairness. It's about preserving the viability and the values of this rural production economy. I'm starting in the West because it's in my backyard. It's what I know best. It's where I want to live, quite frankly. And that's where the risks and the opportunities are greatest as well. With great risk comes great opportunity. I hope you'll help us with that. I hope you'll create your own revolt in your own backyard. And if you want to do that, I would be honored to help you. Thank you.
Great. We have plenty of time for questions, and I think plenty of material to work with. If you have a question, if you could just raise your hand and then state your name and your affiliation.
Bonner Cohen, National Center for Public Policy Research. In the late 1990s, the Clinton administration's Department of Interior carried out an inventory of BLM land, and they found some 3.3 million acres, if memory serves me correctly, that they really wanted to get rid of, that it cost more money for the BLM to manage that land than was really worth their time. Nothing ever became of their recommendation to do that, also including the 8 years of the George W. Bush administration, which did absolutely nothing on this issue. Now, Congressman Bishop, I believe you have introduced legislation to, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, sell off those 3.3 million acres, and I believe that I saw an article not long ago saying that the Obama administration, to the surprise of no one, opposes that because, as Carl pointed out, he says their thing is to expand government dependency, not reduce it. So my question to you, Congressman, is in light of the different alternatives that Carl outlined to all of us, which avenue or avenues would you support to ultimately convey as much of the federal estate as possible, and that being mostly BLM land, from Washington to the states? Thank you.
Actually, it's not my bill. I'm a co-sponsor of it, but it's Congressman Chaffetz's bill, which has passed the House. It is one of a few bills, a handful of bills sitting over in the Senate. and actually needs to go forward. And yeah, actually, the administration did testify against that particular bill, and for whatever reason, it's just mind-boggling. I don't know. So that bill should go forward. That is the low-hanging fruit. The other concept, though, is that we should have as a standard or as our policy the idea of transferring as much land and responsibility for that land to the state as is possible. And it can be either done administratively, it can be done by going to the courts through litigation, it can be done by legislation. One of the things I like that the state of Utah is doing differently than has been done in the past is there's always been a problem with what's the remedy. You say you're being treated unfairly, the East doesn't care that the West is being treated unfairly. What is your remedy? The state of Utah is now coming up with policies and implementations in there so they can say, if we had the land, this is how we would manage it, this is how we would fund it, this is how we would maintain it. And so when you go to courts or go to Congress, you can simply say, this is our remedy, give us the land. So we can tell the East, save your money, give us the land, and everyone's going to be happy.
Come out and visit it.
Back here?
And don't stay too
Sorry,
long.
right here. Hold on, Byron, you're in the queue.
Terry Camp with Senator Hatch's office. Congressman Bishop, I know you've had some experiences with wilderness lands along the southern border, and I wondered if you could talk about the impact federal lands have on immigration reform and border security.
Gee, thanks for opening a whole new avenue of discussion. But in very quick terms, as chairman of the Public Land Subcommittee, we have looked at our problems in the border. 51% of all illegal immigration and almost all illegal drugs and human trafficking are coming through one sector along the border. And so you got to ask yourself why. Why do people want to come here illegally through Tucson and not through Maine? And the simple issue is our southern border is almost 80% owned by the federal government, from Texas to California. Of that, over half of it is in wilderness category or some other land preservation category, which prohibits by law the Bureau, Border Patrol from doing anything except foot reconnaissance. They are prohibited from going in there in anything that's mechanized unless it's a life and death situation or a hot pursuit. That simply means the Border Patrol does not have the ability to control our border. What we need to do statutorily is change those laws, and we did it actually in California so they could finish building the wall. You need to change the law statutorily across the entire border simply to allow the Border Patrol to do what they need to do to secure the border. It's a statutory prohibition that they cannot overcome. You've got to change the law. And I think one of the reasons we cannot look people in the eye and say, yeah, the southern border is secure, is because the laws that create those kind of land designations prohibit the Border Patrol from doing their job. We will not have a secure border until we change those statutes.
Great. Back here, Myron.
Thank you. Myron E. Bell, Competitive Enterprise Institute. I have two questions for both of you. The first is an easy one, which is, well, it's not easy, but what do you think is the path forward if there is a window of opportunity to defederalize or desocialize some or most of the federal lands? What will be the path forward that will actually achieve that in Congress? My second question is, what do you think should be the ultimate goal? Because the last time we had a chance to do this was early in the Reagan administration 33 years ago. And Secretary Jim Watt and a senior economist at the Council of Economic Advisors, Steve Hanke, had a debate. And President Reagan sided with Steve Hanke, and that was that we should not turn the land over to the state, but we should privatize it directly. And particularly, we should sell the federal portion of the ownership of the BLM lands directly to the grazing permittees. They own actually the preponderance of the value of that land typically because they own the water rights. And President Reagan said we should sell it directly and privatize it. And I'm wondering, I don't care which way we go on this, but if we do turn it over to the states, I think we should have a goal in most states that most of that land eventually end up in private ownership, because socialized land is still socialized land. Thank you.
Do you want to have a chance?
Sure, then you can correct me. I'm an all of the above kind of guy, Myron, right now. We're in the informational coalition building phase of this, to be honest with you. We're trying to get people more knowledgeable about this. And so I'm not going to say any idea is a bad idea right now. I think each state is going to some degree, tailor their approach, but we have to have some kind of a unified approach when the rubber meets the road. when it comes down to that Supreme Court decision or to that bill that allows this to happen. So Utah has done a great job leading the way on this with what do you want to do with it. They've come through with another set of bills that now creates things like a Utah Wilderness Act that allows the designation of lands that are turned over to be made wilderness areas in Utah if it makes sense to do that. Well, that shows goodwill. Okay, will that happen? Probably in a few places, but it shows goodwill above all else. They also have a land stewardship commission that will decide on the best use of each piece of land that's turned over as part of the process of turning it over. So this is a multi-year, it's gonna take a while, but you have to show both the goodwill and the institutional stamina that you can pull this thing off before it'll get further in the political process in DC, or before it ends up, I think it ultimately ends up probably at the Supreme Court, no matter who wins, somebody's gonna sue. And as far as the privatization thing, I live in the world of the politically possible. I don't think that's politically possible right now. Now, will some of that land ultimately be privatized? Yeah, sure it will. But some of it will also probably ultimately be fenced off as a result of this process. I think my point is the states are in a much better position to make those decisions than the federal government. And that's what I'm focusing on, is trying to get that decision-making process in state hands where they're much more accountable to the people who live there than in the federal government's hands where they're not accountable to the people who live there, or limited accountability, and they're influenced by people who work down the street a ways as opposed to the people who actually make their living there and have stewarded it for generations.
Actually, you said that very well. There is a realm of possibility. People back east who don't understand the difference. I mean, we went and showed these slides once to somebody who said, okay, now tell me the difference between Forest Service and BLM, which is a legitimate question unless you've been here for 14 years making law on those issues, which he had. So we're talking about people who don't know the difference in the kinds of land, let alone whether it's specialized or privatized or that kind of stuff. You say privatization to them and it shows fears going up and down their spine. It will never happen. But the issue at hand is who should make decisions about these lands. So that somebody in Washington or somebody who actually lives there, and that's what you enunciated. People in the state can make those decisions wisely on whether it needs to be legitimized, whether it needs to be preserved, whether it needs to be open for development that's controlled by the state, or simply open for development, period. They can make that decision as well, if not better, than somebody here in Washington, and that's the first step that has to go. So getting those lands to somebody locally who can make those decisions has to be our first step. And we can't jump to the last step before you do the first step.
Right here? Yeah, Jen?
Hi, Alan Newhouser with U.S. News and World Report. There was mention earlier of special interest here in Washington, and certainly there is no shortage of that here in D.C. But it's also, of course, present in state houses where a buck can often go much farther. What makes you confident that state legislators would be able to push back against that influence, such as with development that might go beyond what many people might be seeking on these federal lands?
That's for me. For one thing, you're talking about 50 states, so a buck may go farther in any particular legislature, but if you're trying to change broad policy, changing it in 50 states is more difficult than changing it in one place that has all the power. The other thing is state legislators, county commissioners, they know they're in the West, in western states, they know their constituents and their constituents know them. I know mine personally. Well, I know my representative personally too. We can have coffee and we can talk. You can't do that, most of you probably, with your representative or your senator, and you certainly can't do it with the local BLM, whoever runs the local lands around here, whereas in Glasgow, Montana, my rancher friend Ted McIntyre talks to his BLM guy every day. They're friends. They know each other well. So I think that it's a matter of accountability. If the decision-making is made closer to the people who are affected by those decisions, there's a lot more feedback if it's the wrong one, and that feedback is much more effective.
Thank you for going first, because I needed some time before I answer that question as one of the most insulting questions I've ever had. You know, I told you about the false premise at the beginning, the idea that only somebody in Washington has the grand view of what is good for this country. It's a stupid, false premise. I was Speaker of the House in Utah. Now I am Chairman of the Public Land Subcommittee here in Washington. Because I am a congressman, I am now better, brighter, more valuable, more moral than I was as Speaker of the House. That is a false premise, and it's a silly premise to think that just because you're in Washington means you make better decisions than somebody in the state legislature. I refute it, I deny it, and I find it personally insulting.
How about over here? We'll get you next.
Hi, my name is Paulina Pineda from Cronkite News Service, a wire service in Arizona. There's been mention of Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, but nothing in Arizona. I know with the new EPA standards, coal mining in northern Arizona on Navajo tribe might suffer. Do you think this is a movement that can be pushed in Arizona? Do people in Arizona want more control over federal land?
Yeah, definitely.
Some people do.
Can you expand on that more than
Yeah,
just
they
yes?
had a Utah-like transfer of public lands bill in their legislature. I think it was in 2013, and it was vetoed by the governor. I don't know if they're going to make another run at it this year or not. It's not one of the states I'm concentrating on. But I know if you talk to county commissioners and ranchers in the state especially, they're very interested in it. I'm not sure if they've come up with a strategy to move it forward.
In my committee, we're inundated with bills from Arizona to try and give Arizona more chance to make decisions for themselves. Yeah, of course they do. They would benefit also.
Okay, right here.
Good morning. My name is Scott Cameron. I'm with a nonprofit called the Reduce Risk from Invasive Species Coalition. And I used to work for a Nevada senator and a California governor, so while I'm an Easterner, I get where you're coming from, gentlemen. In Nevada, for a number of years, there was an arrangement where BLM lands would be sold and be spent on environmental projects in Nevada. It's still ongoing. I'm wondering if a political deal could be struck where a BLM land sold in the West could be used to augment the budgets of the National Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, and so on. Might that be enough to entice our Eastern or liberal friends into supporting land transfers in the West?
Yeah, and there are certain opportunities with that. We do have the federal land transfer flip, or whatever that comes out to be, which allows that kind of process that could be expanded. We have the Land and Water Conservation Fund that allows those kind of concepts to be expanded upon. Yeah. The only problem we do have now is there are some budget rules on what is or is not an earmark, depending on how you use those particular funds. In some respects, I think our definitions are silly, and in some respects, insisting that we have to have equal value before any kind of trade takes place, that's also a silly concept as well. We have to work through some of those, but yeah, it's viable.
Let me add something real quickly to that too. A lot of laws, there are a lot of mechanisms for responsible transfer or management of these federal lands, but when they're invoked or when they're tried, the first thing that happens is you get a lawsuit. And so you have the Forest Service managing timberlands to not get sued. They're not managing it to manage the land so they don't burn, so Mother Nature doesn't manage them, we do. They're managing them so that they don't end up in court and use their entire budget on a legal settlement or fees or just whatever it is that ties them up. And so one of the things we need to look at, aside from this, is that system that allows people to tie up, to misuse the remedies that we already have available. And that's kind of a separate topic, but it's worth bringing up with this, I think.
Okay. Did we have a question over here?
Thank you. I'm Sophie Miller from Congressman Steve Daines' office. You're a good friend, I'm sure.
All right.
I'm wondering, what is the argument against giving states jurisdiction over their lands? What are we fighting against?
You want the flip answer, or you want the? I think Congressman Bishop laid out a lot of it. It's just a lack of understanding of what those lands are. They see pictures of the Grand Tetons and they think that's all the federal lands in the West. They're these pristine national treasures. Well, some of them are, but most of them aren't. Most of them are lands that not only could be used for economic development, for recreation. Those multiple uses aren't just possible, but they're often complementary and additive, in fact. A forest road gives access to hunters and fishermen as well. The infrastructure that comes with fossil fuel development in eastern Montana or in Utah creates infrastructure that, again, forests, recreation users, ATV riders, all those folks can use as well. And so they're not just complementary, they're additive in many cases. And I think the biggest obstacle we have are, first of all, people who believe that humans are a scourge to the planet and just want to keep us off as much real estate as they can. But then others who just plain don't understand that we can do this responsibly and in a way that looks to the future and still betters the human condition and makes and supports that rural production economy.
I appreciate the question, and there's two big broad responses to it. The first one is that we always have, every 60, 70, 80 years, a change in the attitude we have towards public lands. So originally, colonial time, it was to encourage people to come over here. And then it was to sell lands in the territories to make money. So in the 1820s, 25% of the federal budget was from the sale of lands. They wouldn't kick off squatters, so they called them homesteaders. And post-Civil War, we changed our attitude to encourage homesteading. The last of those bills was actually passed in 1916. Progressive era came, and then all of a sudden we had this great idea that we'll just keep everything and administer it so people won't have to mess their hands in those nasty things, and we'll do it scientifically, and we won't let people's desires actually play a role in it. We are about time for that change, and the idea of multiple use and also the ability of opening it up for suing and settling, those things were changes. We're about time to change that paradigm of how we look on lands, and that's why I feel comfortable that as we go forward, we can make some of these changes just instinctively how we deal with land. But the other part of it is also this concept in our Constitution of dual sovereignty. We are one of those few people that said there are some things the federal government should do and have power to do, some things states should do and have power to do. We keep mixing those. And unfortunately, a lot of people in Washington still have this idea that I'm in Congress, I should be able to deal with everything, and including land policies, when actually it was set up to have the states take that responsibility because they can do it so much better. I'm sorry, as bad as state budgets sometimes are, they're not nearly as behind on their appropriations and their maintenance as the National Park Service is. So going back to the concept of dual sovereignty, going back to this idea that we have a paradigm shift on how we deal with public lands, we are due to change that, means that we can go into a better way of handling public lands in the future.
Okay, do we have any more questions out here? We have maybe time for one more, right there.
Hi, Megan Drake with the Washington Times. Mr. Graham, you were talking about how you would like this to become a movement. Can you talk about possibly if that will become a big issue in 2016 and if you're hoping momentum will gain, especially in the face of more glitzy issues like healthcare or education policy?
It's going to be a challenge putting it in the top 10 interest at a national level. But it's going to be, it already is a building and a large and building movement in western states. And we're working to try to make it even a larger issue as the costs of these policies become more apparent at the gas pump, in your electricity bill, and also for those families who are trying to make their living the way they have for a long time. They're going to be looking for answers, and my job is to be out there with those answers. And so it's not going to be yes, I think we will have a movement, but it's going to be focused more in the West than the East. But we need help from the East as well.
That's a good answer.
Is that- Well, very good. I think if we're no more questions, please join me in thanking our speakers.